Bring in retired four-star General Jack Keane, Fox News senior strategic analyst, former Army Vice Chief of Staff, and chairman for the Institute of the Study of War. General, great to have you back with us. You know, Jackie was just laying out the Russian agenda, and we know that that Putin has written 5,000-word essays on the history of Russia and the fact that Ukraine is part of Russia. It's hard for me to imagine that President Trump or Secretary of State Rubio or the people that are in there are going to have a lot of patience with long lectures on why they're here and their vision of Europe.
Yeah, well, Putin is a master at filibustering at these events. And even on the phone, he does a lot of that with President Trump. Listen, the whole U.S. team is very much on to, Putin and the people that are around him. I mean, this is the 7th in-person talk that President Trump has had with Putin, which makes him one of the most experienced American presidents ever dealing with the Soviet Union or with President Putin, who's been around for 25 years. His team around him may not have as much experience, but the key actor here, the president, is. And listen, he knows all about Putin and his charm offensive. As a matter of fact, Trump is very much himself charming and personable in these discussions, and you can see that he was a welcoming, pleasant host when Putin came. And I know for a fact that President Trump knows every factoid about Putin, and what he has done over 25 years, and that he's a thug, and that he's a killer, and he's a defined war criminal and meets all the standards for that, and he's a bold-faced liar, and you cannot trust him. He knows all of that. At the same time, he's an adversary. He started a war, and President Trump is trying to get to stop it. And he really can't stop it without him. And that's the reality of what we're facing here. So we'll see here. We don't know, what's happening. But we do know there's a lunch that's coming after this. That's going to be a substantive meeting. That's why the economic advisors and others are there. I would suspect, at the discussions we're having right now, the president and possibly Wickoff and Rubio, but the president for sure has laid out a general outline of some of the good things that would happen, Vladimir Putin, if you move towards a ceasefire. And I would suspect at lunch, some of the specifics of what that would mean in terms of the deals, the economic return of an economic relationship, a return of a geopolitical relationship with Putin going forward here, if we're willing to take the steps with a ceasefire. But the real thing is to establish the conditions for an end of war. That is the hopeful path that we want to see coming out of that. And I think we got a ways to go here yet before this evening is over.
I agree. General, to your point, I talked to Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick on the Air Force One, as well as the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. They had their own meeting with President Trump and essentially came out with that very thing you're saying, the optimistic pitch to the business people and to the Russian officials about what could possibly happen. And that's one of the reasons they're on this trip. We talk about Steve Witkoff and Secretary Rubio and Secretary Hegseth. We are not talking yet about the military people involved here. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Cain, Dan Cain, as well as the Supreme Allied Commander. Also in here that can really get to the military import if they go down the different areas of Ukraine that perhaps Russia wants to expand on, particularly Donetsk.
Yeah, very much so. And I spoke to the chairman a couple of days ago about this very thing. And this is General Cain, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And he's very knowledgeable himself about the significance of the terrain involved and the military implications of it if there are discussions about a land swap. And he's brought the Supreme Allied Commander, as you mentioned, General Grinkich, with him. And he's been in the job about a month, taking over from General Cavoli. But he deals with Ukraine and what is happening there every single day. And he was very familiar with it before he took on the position he has now as well. So he's schooled in the depth of these implications, and I'm absolutely delighted that the president chose to take them along with them, which shows an appreciation for the stakes that are here if they get to any discussion whatsoever on the land swap, et cetera, which the president thinks would really be at a follow-on meeting that would likely involve President Zelensky. But just in the case it does, certainly he has those people who are experienced to have that discussion, and that would be critical if that comes up.
And one of the things that we know Putin wants is to have a much smaller Ukraine military. So with our military representatives there, General Jack Keane, what do you think that part of a conversation looks like?
Well, certainly, yeah, Putin wants to demilitarize Ukraine for a fact. But, you know, something our viewers have to understand, Ukraine, put the Russian military aside, just Ukraine's military today is the most powerful military in Europe.
Which is incredible.
Except for the Turks. And if Putin took charge of Ukraine and took their defense establishment and all their innovation, which he would get as well, it becomes an incredible platform for the expansion that he has been talking about for years. So we also have to give a lot of credit to the Ukrainian military and what they have been able to achieve. After all, when you started at the beginning, Brett, back when the invasion began, people like myself were all over Fox News saying this isn't going to last very long. Russia is the dominant force here. They're going to overwhelm the Ukrainians. Well, look where we are, 42 months into this war. And in the last 2+ years, Russia has only gained 1% of the territory. Quite remarkable what has been happening. And that specific key terrain that you circled last night on television, Brett, they've been after that for 26 months, focused on that. And they can't get there. Why? Because of this innovative, tough Ukrainian military that is outgunned and outmanned, is outfighting them. It is truly remarkable, and we can't forget who they are and what they represent.
Thanks to drone technology and other advancements that we're actually learning from the Ukrainians.
That's right.
It's pretty amazing. General Jack Keane, as always, thank you very much.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.